All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Wednesday, September 22nd of 2021. Off to an interesting start here this morning with the three-game early slates on both FanDuel and DraftKings and maybe presumably Yahoo, if they had that slate as well, getting canceled because of the two postponements here early in the day. So no football on today. Decided I was going to play a little bit of baseball. Entered to the main slate tonight. I was also entered to those early slates. So was working on my final lineups there when the Reds game got postponed. And of course, all of the contests got refunded. But no worries. We've got an MLB main slate coming up here on us later this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. And of course, more football coming in tomorrow and the Sunday main slate fast approaching. So I know a lot of content and conversations going on around week 3 NFL main slate stuff now. So I will go ahead and just get us started here today, everyone. First of all, I have a lone one question that came into our support inbox overnight. Bit of an interesting question, pretty open-ended, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on it. But a great day if you have questions for me, if you have been building your MLB lineups the last couple days and have some questions or some thoughts or just something you want to share, or you're looking ahead to football Sunday or NFL Showdown, right? We had the Monday night game. We've got the Thursday night game coming up. If you have any questions, a really good day to ask questions. Go ahead and pop them into the YouTube chat or the Office Hours channel in Slack, and I will answer questions in the order that they come in. But before we jump into everything, I want to just once again plug our weekly Max Challenge, because this is just such an awesome deal to be a part of. We are giving away prizes here all NFL season for playing contests that we would recommend you be playing anyway, based on your bankroll. All you have to do, wear the SaberSim avatar as your avatar on FanDuel or DraftKings or both. Play the Pooch Punt on FanDuel, the 5-cent Pooch Punt, or the 50-cent Minimax on DraftKings for the NFL Sunday main slate. Max that contest out and then send Andy at SaberSim.com a email with a screenshot of showing your avatar and your entries in the contest sometime after lock, and we'll enter you into this contest. If you are the highest overall score of everybody in the SaberSim contest, we will... Let's see, what do we give you? We'll give you some tickets to upcoming contests. We'll give you free SaberSim, and you'll get access to a free roll that's going to take place at the end of the season. That's going to be a lot of fun. Opportunity to win a little bit more on top of that. Should you take one of these contests down, you'll obviously win the contest on the sites, but we're going to pay you a little more, give you a ton of free SaberSim, and you're going to get a cool championship belt or trophy, depending on which site you win. And if you keep this up for all 18 weeks, which I know there are still quite a few people, I know it's only been 2 weeks, but we have quite a few people that have played both weeks. If you keep it up all 18 weeks, you're going to get some Yeti gear, you get more free SaberSim, and you get a free entry into that free roll at the end of the season. So this is really just a great deal. No reason not to be a part of this. There is a price point here that is $7.50 to play. So on FanDuel, super affordable. And then there's the price point that is $75 to play on the 50-cent Minimax on DraftKings. So overall, just worth it to be a part of this if you're playing NFL DFS anyway, because both of these contests grade out really well based on our metrics. They allow you to get a ton of lineups in, which gives you a greater chance at building one of those top 1% high upside overall lineups, and you get stuff for free. So just a great deal overall. But anyway, let's go ahead and just get started. I see a few other people have started to join the stream now, so welcome everybody. Thank you for watching. Of course, for all of you that listen to and watch this show after the fact as a recording on YouTube, I appreciate you as well. Guys, I only have one question here in my queue today. It's going to be a good one. I think it's an interesting question to talk about, but it is a very good day for you to pop any questions you have in the queue for the show today. So I actually am going to go ahead and tackle this question real quick here, because I just saw it pop into Slack. This is from CP Hustler, and I know this has come up a lot recently. He said, I've not seen an answer to the question about not being able to upload our Yahoo contest into SaberSim. Did I miss it? Unfortunately, the entry editor is not supported for Yahoo. They do something very unique with their CSV process, where CSVs are kind of on a per contest basis. The management of those CSVs is a little bit trickier. We hope to have entry editor support for Yahoo in the future, but it's not set up right now. And I know it is confusing because you can get there even when you are in Yahoo. So we will be just like turning that off so that people aren't getting confused there. But unfortunately, we don't have entry editor support for Yahoo. I would actually too also recommend more from a process standpoint if you're playing Yahoo. First of all, it's a great idea to play Yahoo. The contests are a lot softer. They do awesome deals. They do rake-free contests. Their contests overlay all the time. But I would probably recommend, at least in my experience, what I found easiest is to just stick to a specific contest. Find a contest where you can get all the action you want just by playing that single lone contest, because again, their CSV process, at least the last time I played it, as far as I remember, and this is the reason why it's not set up on our end, is that you're going to get a unique single CSV for every contest you're playing, not one that includes all of the contests you're playing. That's kind of the tricky part there. But anyway, I know that is a bit confusing that you can technically do it on the app right now. So we'll pull that down just so it's not there and confusing anybody. But good question. I'm going to go ahead now and here, let's go ahead and jump over to the app. And let's look at football. And again, interesting question here. So let me go ahead and get this pulled up and I'll just read this here first. Okay. So this was from Rob here. And Rob said, I mainly play large field, 20 entry max, small amount tournaments. Great. Those are great tournaments, especially for football. I find myself all over the place when setting build parameters, specifically unique player limits, ownership limits, and variance/correlation parameters. I understand that there is no one perfect strategy, and variance when winning is inherent to DFS in general. I could really use some help in determining what parameters I should hang my hat on and continue to grind with. I mainly play classic and showdown slates. So a really good question here. And I think I was struggling a little bit, thinking a lot this morning about how I wanted to answer this particular question. Because there's a lot of different ways to take it. And I think ultimately what the important thing to remember here is you need to have a process, right? There needs to be some kind of repeatable action behind your DFS process to be successful, right? First of all, if you are changing your process constantly, you're not really going to be able to look back at any meaningful time period or any sample size and make a determination of what you are doing well, what you aren't, if your process is working, if it isn't, right? If you're changing constantly and doing things differently, you need to have some level of repeatability there for your process to be successful. And when you find that successful process, right, you need to do it for some time to reap the benefits of that and to realize your edge in those contests, right? That's why you need a process. But the issue here or the concern, I think, is that a process that isn't itself dynamic, that is very static and is identical regardless of slate context, I think can be dangerous. So I think when you're kind of coming up with your process and speaking about exactly this particular question here in general, like build parameters, player ownership limits, variance and correlation parameters, I think the concern here is that you can potentially be overly restricting SaberSim from making slate contextualized decisions about the best way to build lineups. So, for example, what I am basically saying is that if you are going to go in and say, I am not going to roster a player over 25% ownership, projected ownership ever, right? You are going to limit yourself potentially from situations where it makes sense to have exposure to that player, maybe because they have a spectacular value, or you are limiting yourself from particular lineups that include that player, where you're using that player, but perhaps the rest of the lineup is correlated and well leveraged in such a way that the lineup overall is positive EV, right? Same deal with stacking types, right? If you say I am only going to play QB +2 with a 1 runback stacking type for all 100% of my lineups, 100% of the time, you are going to restrict yourself from lineups where perhaps it is a team that makes sense that there are 3 viable pass catchers that can be successful, right? There are teams like the Steelers, the Bengals, who else? Those are probably 2 good examples. the Buccaneers, the Rams, right, where there are these multiple pass catchers that can be successful, you're removing those lineups. If you're always forcing in a run back, right, you are assuming that every single stack that is profitable or is positive EV2 roster has a logical run back situation, right? You are assuming every game is a game stack. Well, you are assuming every stack is played in a game stackable environment. And you're making these assumptions that, to be completely frank, because of the way SaberSim works, because we're leveraging our simulations to determine the projections and correlations for players, you don't really have to. And I think you can be more flexible than that. So a few things I would recommend if you are struggling with how to set up a process. What I would do is rely heavily. It is fine to have general kind of rules that you are looking to achieve, right? You could say that you, in general, prefer to game stack games. That is your general approach. You could say that you are cautious of high ownership plays, maybe at certain positions or certain salary ranges, right? You can have this middle ground approach. But what I would recommend for most players is to approach your build with a level of flexibility, which is why, and this is what I do. I don't like to overly restrict my player pool in step one. I don't like to mess with the settings too much. A lot of times I won't even set a stacking rule, and I will build lineups with default settings and see what I get out of here. So let's go ahead and talk about this here a little bit. And what you can do then is come up with a process, a level of repeatability on step 3 that is dynamic and responds to the different slate, right? You've got different matchups every week. You've got different projections. You've got different salaries. Ownership is going to be different. Part of the beauty of using a tool like SaberSim is it's going to parse all of that information for you and give you this pool of 500 lineups that you can work with. You don't have to be the one setting the rules up front to tell it how to build successful lineups for that slate. It already knows how to do that. You could be the one making the decisions of which lineups you are going to play. So let's make a quick update here. And what I mean now is that you can have this kind of slate-specific approach that, let's say you go over to your stack types, and the first thing you do is look at stack types. And you can look at 3+1s and potentially say, that is a little bit too much for me. I don't typically like to play 2+1s, but you can look through these lineups and look at this and see, okay, I'm actually mostly getting Stafford stacks here. And I think these 3 pass catchers are viable. I think this game environment makes sense to stack. I'm actually okay with this. But if you weren't, you could uncheck certain lineups to just remove them, or you could limit your exposure to this stack type, or you could remove this stack type, right? But you've given yourself an opportunity to look at the slate context overall and make a determination that makes sense for this particular slate and these particular sets of lineups, right? You could have the same idea with game or stack types that aren't full game stacks, right? And look at the lineups here that are coming up. So again, it's a lot of Ram stacks. It's a Trevor Lawrence Jag stacks, right? It's KC and the KC and LA. It's Detroit and Baltimore here, right? And stacked on the Detroit side. These are games. It looks like the builder is targeting games that I would actually be interested in game stacking. So maybe this is a week that I want to go ahead and force the builder to game stack my lineups, right? So let's go ahead and just remove. And I don't want to play, maybe you don't want to play builds that are QB+4, right? So maybe we've arrived at a set of lineups that we're comfortable with from the stacking type, but we did it with some like looking at the slate rather than kind of setting a blanket rule that we're just going to lock and load, right? And force. We could do the same thing from the players, right? Maybe you have the standpoint that you have, some concerns about rostering chalky wide receivers because wide receivers are higher variance. So we can look at this and say, okay, who's going to be chalky this week? Well, at this point in the week, we think Cooper Kupp is probably going to be pretty chalky. And we can see that, yeah, he's probably pretty chalky, but Ram stacks are actually our favorite stack. Stafford doesn't look like he's going to be too highly owned at the moment. While Kupp is probably going to be pretty chalky and looks like Higbee is going to be pretty chalky. We're able to build these Ram stacks that pull in a lot of other low-owned players and it seems like this is maybe the builder's favorite particular stack. So I'm going to leave it, right? I'm not just going to blindly fade highly owned receivers, but I'm going to, in this case, let myself play some of those guys, right? So you could do the same thing with like lineup ownership, right? You could come at this from a very blanket statement playing, I don't play lineups with a total ownership sum over 100. But then you look at the particular lineup, and we handle this, as a complete set, right? That's how you enter these. You don't enter players, you enter lineups. This is a big game stack. It's going to be a super highly correlated lineup. It's going to count on a very particular game outcome of basically Tampa Bay and LA going off. And this lineup is correlated enough that it has me interested in it. So I'm going to keep it in, right? And these aren't supposed to be specific examples, but what I'm trying to kind of explain is that because of the way SaberSim works, because we're resting on game simulations to fuel everything, right? We know how these games can play out. We know exactly how correlated players are. I would focus on process ideas that allow you to be somewhat flexible, right? And you can still have a process. You can still have something that is repeatable every single week. You can say, my process, for example, if I were to explain it and explain how it is dynamic, but it's consistent, right? I do research around the industry and on social media and on YouTube and things like that to dial in ownership projections closer to what I think they are going to be. I run high sim variance research builds that typically look like this to determine what players have the most upside in the player pool and what players are likely to be higher owned than they should be. And then I run a build of lineups that I intend to play, and I adjust my exposures to certain players such that I am positively leveraged to players that I think are going to be underowned and negatively leveraged to players that I think are going to be overowned. That is my process that I do every single week, but it allows SaberSim to work its kind of magic about helping me find what those different players are and what the different opportunities are to be successful doing that. And I'm flexible, and I can adapt to different slates, right? Your particular process could be that you, I don't even know. It's kind of hard to just come up with what an alternative process is at the, maybe you play 6 lineups a week. You play, I don't know, a couple single entries and a 3 max, a few single entries and a 3 max, and you go through and you do your own research to figure out what particular quarterbacks and stacks you want to target. You look at what SaberSim gives you out of the gate and look for commonalities between your own individual research and what SaberSim gave you. So maybe you play 6 lineups and you do your own research and you look for commonalities, and you, for example, in your research liked Brady and Herbert. So you land on Brady and Herbert, and those are the guys that you play, right? I don't know. Here, let's see. I don't want to get this I don't want to make this too long, but maybe, okay, so you play Brady and Herbert, and then you I don't know, you dive into running backs and look for opportunities to find leverage in your running backs, and you like to play a really tight pool of running backs. But regardless, the point here is that you're being flexible. If you told me that your process was to go into the player pool and remove all players over 20% owned, or all players over 15% owned, and you remove all players with a value under 2, and you set a stacking rule that forces a very rigid stacking rule in 100% of your lineups. Even one of these is probably fine, right? We talk about those here on stream. These are obviously fine for one. But if you told me you went in and you forced stacking rules that look like this in 100% of your lineups, and then you start new build, and then you go in and you remove all lineups with total ownership sum over 100, and you remove all lineups that have a projected score under a certain amount, right? You are setting all of these parameters and these rules that you may have to do on a traditional optimizer, but you don't have to do here because of the way that we build lineups. And that is probably just hurting you more than helping you. So again, that's the ultimate point. That's the ultimate kind of thing I would come down to when you're thinking about building your process, is ask yourself, between different slates, is this process allowing me to do things differently? Am I giving myself an opportunity to respond to what are the realities of this particular slate? And if your answer to that is no, I do this regardless, no matter what, I might check your assumptions of why you're doing that thing. Are you setting a stack rule? Well, a stacking rule is intended to get correlation, right? Well, we are accounting for correlation already, and you can dial in your stacking rules on step 3 a little bit if you want to go from there, but we are accounting for correlation already, right? Are you setting really stringent ownership rules on how owned a lineup or a certain player can be to be in your pool? Well, we're accounting for ownership already with ownership fade, where we take into account the player variance and the average ownership of the position and build you lineups that have the right amount of ownership in them compared to the upside of the rest of the lineup. So if you want lineups that are lower owned, maybe a more flexible way of dealing with that would be to turn your ownership fade slider up rather than setting a blanket rule. Are you removing players that are under a certain point per dollar value? Well, the goal of that would be probably making sure that lineups have a certain overall projected score, but a player even that has a low point per dollar value is only going to show up in the lineup if they have enough upside to pay off that value at their ceiling outcome, right? So we could look at a guy like Austin Eckler, who at the moment doesn't have a super high value compared to his price, and say, I'm going to fade him because his point per dollar value is good, but he's only going to show up in lineups at the rate at which he has his ceiling outcomes in our game sims anyway. You don't have to worry about that. So anyway, I think I am getting to the point now where I'm talking a little bit in circles. So Rob, I'll send you over a timestamped recording here to this section of office hours here today. If you have any follow-up questions on this, please just reach out and I'm happy to dive in a little bit further. I think this is an interesting question. And as you're kind of thinking about your process overall, be happy to talk about this a little bit more. So cool. I'm going to keep us rolling here and jump into this question from Clifford here. He said, player pools for 20 max and the difference of a player pool for 150 max. So our sliders here, the settings that you see in your build settings are back tested, and they're back tested against past contests that ran. And we've run thousands of lineups at every single combination of sliders, every single possible combination here. And the default values are set to what we find build the highest expected value sets of lineups for given contests. The slider that is going to have the biggest impact on your overall player pool is the sim variance slider. The higher this slider goes, the smaller the buckets of game simulations we're using to determine each player's projection when we put them in the lineup, right? The bigger the impact of extreme outlier ceiling and floor type games have on your projections. So when you select 20 max and you see sim variance high 8, that is going to create a certain size player pool for your 20 max lineups. That's going to also create a certain level of exposure to the players in your lineups. When you're playing a 150 max, you are going to see it's going to jump to 10. You're probably going to get a bigger player pool, not even just because you have 150 lineups, but also like if you built 20 max right at 8 versus 10, you'd probably get more players in your pool at 10 than you would at 8. But anyway, when you go to 150 max, you're also going to get more players in your pool. This is another thing. This is like a perfect follow-up to that question where I would say a rule of thumb that I only roster this many running backs and this many quarterbacks or this many total players in my player pool is probably ultimately going to hurt you more than it is going to help you, because it's not going to be flexible and it's not going to respond to the individual slate context. You have to set rules like that and dial things in like that on a traditional optimizer that just optimizes for average projection, because if you don't, you're going to get really wonky looking player pools. You're probably by default going to get extremely tight player pools where you just absolutely maximize the value of the highest projected point per dollar guys. And you have to set all these rules to say, like, give me at least this many players, but no more than this many players. You don't really have to do this here. So I would say, yeah. So Clifford said, so you're saying keep everyone in your pool. Yes, I would say as you're thinking about your player pool overall, first thing I would do is definitely keep all the players in your pool to begin with, because you're going to have an opportunity to remove anybody you don't want at the end anyway. Use the default value for sim variance for the contest you're playing, and then run a build. And we'll let this build. And then on step 3, this is the point where I would say feel as comfortable as you like to make any adjustments to your player pool from this point. Anything you do that lowers the overall size of your player pool, that tightens up your player pool, is going to make you riskier and increase the upside of your entire pool of lineups. If you play one quarterback in 20 lineups, if he fails, all 20 lineups fail. If he's the best quarterback on the week, you have 20 shots at building out the rest of the right lineup, right? If you increase the size of your player pool, you are going to lower your risk, but probably also lower your upside overall, because you have less shots capitalizing on certain outcomes. I would say if you are interested in condensing your pool, I would do so at the positions that are lower variance, which are QB and running back. These positions, these players have generally tighter ranges of outcomes. They are generally, they probably typically have higher floors. They are less likely to have like a significant downside game. So if you want to tighten up your player pool from here and maybe remove some of these guys that you're only playing in a single lineup and get a tighter pool of running backs here, you can see sometimes it's going to pop a few of these guys back in. Or pop different guys back in, still just in one lineup, but we can just keep tightening this up until we have a pool of running backs that we're happy with. So Clifford said, makes sense. This is what I do, just QB running back. Yeah, I think this is a totally fine approach, and you're tightening up. You're still giving yourself a lot of width at the higher variance positions of wide receiver, tight end, defense, but you're playing a relatively tight pool of QBs and running backs. You've still given SaberSim an opportunity to tell you what some of those best plays are while considering the entire player pool. There is nothing wrong with, for example, saying I'm taking a stand on Dalvin Cook this week and I'm Xing him out in step 1 so that I build a pool of 500 lineups that have no Dalvin Cook and I have more room to make adjustments. But I would recommend only doing that after you've at least tried one build without touching a thing. When you run one build without touching a thing, you at least get to see what SaberSim wants to do on the particular slate. And then you can kind of leave your mark on it. But personally, me, I never touch the player pool before my build. I do all of my work here in step 3. So I see a couple other questions rolling in here. I'm going to go ahead and jump back up and get to these questions that came in a little bit earlier. Pops6870 said, hi, Jordan. Do I always have to lock in 2 players to build lineups? I deleted all players till I got the 50 players I wanted and still had to lock 2 players. Is that because it's not an optimizer? So that's interesting. There's really a few things. I would say that the easiest thing that you can do, like just the easiest way you can kind of deal with the message that pops up here, is to just adjust 2 players' projections by any value. And a very small adjustment isn't going to have really any impact on the games, on the optimizer. So I would say like doing something like this and this is probably like the simplest way to just avoid that message. The other option is that you can just run your build here. And if we go to like this build, which we ran here at the start, and I'll reset everything back and reset this, and it should bring that message back up. Oh, it didn't. Okay. When you run, let's run a fresh build here. Let's just do 3 lineups so it goes quick. And when we run this build, the other option is like, as long as you're building more than 1 lineup, you can still get the build to run, and then you can just make your adjustments here on step 3. So you shouldn't really have to go through the trouble of all of this. I guess if you're limiting your pool to just 50 players that you wanted, that's great. You don't have to, I guess the point I'm trying to make though is you don't have to feel like you have to lock 2 players ever, right? All you need to do is just make 2 adjustments to basically anything. So 2 minor adjustments to projections will remove that message. You can do that here on step 3, or you can do that on step 1. You can do it by locking players, but you don't have to. You just have to make two adjustments to projections, exposures, or ownership, and then it should run. So let me know if that helps. That's the easiest way to do it in general. Mr. All-Star 23 said, how do you come up with ownership projections? What we do is we run thousands and thousands of lineups at very high sim variance builds, and the exposures that we get out of those builds become our ownership projections. That is how we do it. So I think that in general, we have a very good ownership model. We do not have a perfect ownership model. No model is perfect. There are some limitations that we are aware of here and that we plan to kind of improve upon in the future and as we move along. One of the things I think that happens here is that you end up, we have an ownership model that I think at times gets a little bit closer to what like optimal ownership would be if everybody was playing very sharply. We, I think, can under project the highest owned plays on the slate. So for example, if Dalvin Cook plays and he's Cooper Kupp, I think is a better example, right? Because he's not questionable. So I do think Cooper Kupp is likely to be an extremely chalky receiver this week, right? He's had 2 great weeks to start. His target share is crazy high. He plays pretty much all the snaps and runs routes all the time. I think he's likely to be very high owned, but I think he could be higher owned than this. And the ownership model that we have is basically saying that this is probably an appropriate level of ownership if the field was like extremely sharp. And I think sometimes, put another way, on the high end, we fail to project the highest owned plays actually as high as they are going to be. Another limitation of this, because it is a completely data-driven approach to generating ownership projections, is that we're not going to very well pick up on narratives. In NFL, you definitely get some of that. In NBA, and I mean, really every sport, you have some of this. But if there's a certain player that is getting chalky, maybe because he's getting touted all across the industry, or because there's a particular narrative that people are counting on, I don't know if we really have one like this week. But you know, the kind of thing like revenge game narratives and all those things, right? That sometimes can have an impact on ownership. And we're not going to pick up well on that just because we're using a really data-driven approach. The final limitation that I think you should be aware of is that our input to our ownership projections is our projections and game simulations. So if we are far off from the field or from Vegas on a certain game or team or player, it's likely that we're also probably going to be off on their ownership projection. So for example, I haven't really dove deep into ownership projections for this week yet, so I don't know exactly who's going to be super chalky. But DeAndre Swift is probably a good example, right? We've got a pretty good projection for him right now at this particular point in the week. He's the second highest point per dollar play on the slate. Is the field going to rush to play a running back against Baltimore's defense in a game where they have probably like a 20-point total? Maybe not. We are assuming he's going to be the second most owned running back on the slate so far because we like him in this game. But this is probably not so true is actually what his ownership might be if the slate started right now. I could be wrong. Again, I haven't done a ton of research on this, but that's like one that jumps out of the gate. So those are all things that we kind of understand are some minor limitations at the moment with the ownership model. Again, I think it is very good. I think it does a very good job of correcting or it does a very good job of predicting the overall ownership rankings for players, but I think it can be a little bit low on the high end. And I think it sometimes can misjudge when the SaberSim model is just particularly high or low on a player, and that's affecting the ownership. So Barry said, do you change the amount of lineups in your pool in the settings? I do actually a lot. And it depends on what I'm trying to do. So on like, for example, my Sunday main slate, I'm sitting down an hour before lock or an hour and a half before lock, and I'm going to like actually start really building my lineups that I'm going to use. Because I make a lot of adjustments to exposures and I plan on kind of making a lot of changes to those lineups overall, I am typically, say I'm playing 80 lineups on the slate or something like that, which is fairly regular. I typically will just make this be 1,500 because I want the biggest pool possible. I'm building lineups an hour to an hour and a half before lock anyway, and I just want the biggest pool, right? So I'm going to do it that way. And I'll make that adjustment. On baseball, for example, I've been playing a lot of single entry lately because the contests are starting to get smaller. Some of the best contests in the lobby, I feel, are the single entry and the 3-max stuff. So I've been focusing a lot on that. I might be playing 10 lineups max, maybe 5 on particular slates. And I'm building my final build before lock and setting my sliders to where I'm at. I don't need 500 lineups to get 5. Sometimes I'm even doing this. A lot of times I'm doing this, right? If I feel like I've already kind of done enough research and I know that I'm not going to make a lot of adjustments, sometimes I'm even like doing this because the build's going to run a lot faster. I get it done quicker. I don't need all those lineups. So by default, I think this is typically just going to say 500, which is totally fine. Building 500 is not that big of a deal. But you can definitely feel encouraged to lower this when you're not planning on making a lot of changes and you don't have as much time to set your lineups. And I feel like you can raise it when you're planning on making a lot of changes in step 3 and you have a lot of time to do that. But I think it's a great idea. So Don said, when I change ownerships to be different from SaberSim own, does SaberSim automatically use my ownership number? Yes. Yes, we do. So if you think Chris Sale, we've switched over to baseball here, but if you think Sale is going to be 40% owned, yes, we use this instead. So Clifford had another question here. How about Showdown? Are you using historical data like 3351, 154224? I don't like a lot of that historical data line of thinking for Showdowns because I think a lot of the information that you find out there that's based on that kind of thing, like historically, is resting on assumptions that just don't work, right? Like what you'll often see is there'll be something that says, okay, so there'll be a way of trying to categorize the game. So maybe you categorize this as a blowout because it's a 8-point spread roughly here, assuming that we're on with Vegas, a low scoring kind of blowout type game. And you attempt to categorize that game and then look at what happened in other games with that particular spread or that particular result and try to make a determination about what the optimal roster construction is. The problem is you are making some assumption there that this game is going to play out like those other games, or at the very least that all games that have this particular spread or close to this particular spread and totals play out on average the same way. And I don't think that's really true. And I don't think you really have to do that because we're simulating the games, we understand what the game outcome looks like and what the optimal construction is when the final score of this game is Texans 14, Panthers 3. And we understand what the optimal construction of this game is when it works out that the final score is the Panthers 48, Texans 35, right? We understand, we've simulated these game outcomes, so we just kind of get it. And when you're building lineups for Showdown and your sim variance is typically by default at 10, you're actually using those individual game sims to determine the projections for each player as we build in the lineups. I know I said that before, but it's still true here. So when you get to the end here of looking at your individual game stacks, so we'll let this build and we'll look at what the constructions look like. So you can look at this and say, so I have basically 6 lineups where I have Carolina 5-1 stacks. I have 8 lineups where I have Carolina 4-2 stacks. I have 25% overall 3-3s. The reason these aren't equivalent is because of the way we think a stack works includes a QB. So it is a little bit confusing, but it must include a QB, right? So you could look at this, right? But you can know that even if you're looking at these and you're looking at your Carolina stacks here, let's go ahead and make some adjustments here quickly. So even if maybe this particular stack is common or uncommon or has positive leverage or negative leverage, you know that this is resting on a game simulation here where this particular stack construction and these players made sense. The best argument I've heard overall for using this and for diving into this would be from a contrarian standpoint, particularly maybe when you didn't have a stance you wanted to take on a certain player. So we can look at this, and I think it's pretty straightforward to just immediately look at this game and see what the chalk constructions are going to be, right? So again, this is a lower scoring game. There's a backup quarterback playing for the Texans. We have the best running back in the game, right? The most common constructions here are probably going to be McCaffrey, captain, right? They're going to be very heavy Panther onslaught constructions. The Panther defense is probably going to be popular. I think secondarily, everybody always plays quarterback, so people are probably going to play a bunch of Darnold at captain, and those are going to be your popular constructions. If you didn't have a stance you wanted to take on a certain player, and actually this is a particularly interesting game for that, because I think flipping the script and just saying that DJ Moore is the optimal, or even Robbie Anderson is the optimal captain, I think is an interesting way to go. But say you didn't really have a stance that you wanted to take on a per player basis, you could flip the script here of saying that you're going to play Panther overweight lineups and just flip to play Houston overweight lineups, or at least equal, and differentiate that way and get a little bit different on the field, right? So yes, Christian McCaffrey here is probably going to be a very, like, the most popular captain, but this roster construction actually is probably kind of unique because it's 4 Texans, and all of these 4 Texans lineups are probably pretty unique. You could even go further and like, I'd be curious to say, so we're only going to play lineups that are Houston overweight, right? And you're still going to be kind of with the field. You're going to do things. Maybe you like don't want to do this. You don't want to do this. This is kind of interesting, right? You're still going to be playing popular captains, especially McCaffrey, but you're doing it in a way that is unique and different. This I think is actually a pretty good approach, and I think this makes some sense. But you're doing this again. I feel like I've established a bit of a theme for this entire office hours now from that first question, right? We're doing this in a way that is flexible, that is responsive to the slate context itself. We're not just like forcing a particular rule here. And I'd be really, really careful. I really urge you guys to be careful of research that is done resting on an assumption that games with a similar spread or total all play out the same, or even play out roughly the same, right? Because there's somewhere buried in there is a bad assumption. You're either assuming that games with these kinds of spreads and totals often play out on average the same way. You are assuming, like, even if they did, the players in the game are so different. Like, someone might tell you wide receiver ones are often the best captain to play in these particular game scripts. And it's like, how valuable is that? Because every team has a different wide receiver one, and the salaries are different, and the ownership of those guys is going to be different. Like, the context is completely changed. And that kind of stuff is just, it is a tool, frankly, that people that are using inferior tools like traditional optimizers and average projections have to rely on, because they can't deal with the entire range of outcomes of a particular individual game. But we can, and we know what those outcomes are, and we leverage them directly when we're building lineups. And even when you go in here and change your roster constructions and say, I'm going to be playing Houston overweight 4 and 5 stacks, you're not even doing that blindly. We didn't force a rule and say only Houston 4 and 5 stacks no matter what. We are limiting a pool of 500 lineups, all of which are based on an individual game sim that we have, to pick out roster constructions that we think are going to be more unique, right? But this still is a great lineup because it's resting on a game simulation that probably happens at least in the range of outcomes. So anyway, that was a great question. I enjoyed talking about that one. So thank you for asking that. That was a good one. But again, the whole theme of the day here, I guess we kind of have a theme of the day now is use processes that are flexible, that can respond to the uniqueness of the slate you're playing, rather than processes that are locked in, that are always the same thing. So Clifford also said, do you recommend we upload your own ownership projections? I mean, I'm not gonna sit here and recommend that you go anywhere else for ownership projections, but if you are doing some kind of process for your own individual ownership estimation that takes place like on a spreadsheet or is finalized on a spreadsheet, I think it's a lot easier to just use the upload than it is to go player by player. Actually, for my individual process, that is what I end up doing. Is I'll end up using an upload that includes ownership projections that are like kind of slightly tweaked for every player. And it's much easier to use the upload. And I know there are definitely a lot of people out there that just copy and paste into this table, which is fine, and that's why we have it. I think it's way easier to just use the CSV upload button and just pick the original file. So I'd recommend doing that as well. So another question here. Would you suggest running 1,500 lines to see more types of lineups? That is exactly actually what I typically do in my process for pretty much any slate I play. One of my favorite ways to get familiar with the slate overall actually is to run a big build. And what I'll actually typically do is I'll turn correlation off and ownership fade off. I turn sim variance all the way to 10. So I'm using single game simulations to build each lineup. And I'll build 1,500 lineups. And I'll let this thing build. And what I basically just want to do is just see how often different players show up. Because what we're basically doing is we're going to SaberSim and saying, okay, use single game simulations for every game on the slate. Do that 1,500 times. And then give me the percent of time somebody shows up in that lineup, right? The more they show up in that lineup, the more upside they particularly have. Right? If we're using single game simulations and a certain quarterback is showing up 20% of the time, well, that means at least in 1,500 game simulations, 20% of the time, that quarterback is the best one to roster. So he probably has a lot of upside. This is how I actually research every single slate I play. Every sport, every slate, Showdown, Classic. I love starting this way. We call this a research build. We talk about this a lot here on stream. And this is my favorite approach to get familiar with the slate and where the upside is overall. So we'll give this, since I've gotten to 1,000 out of 1,500 lineups, we'll give this a moment just to finish up. I'll talk a little bit about what I use here and what I gain from this, and then we'll move on. So. But cool. So let's go ahead, give this a sec. Okay, so I'll slightly touch these down just for the purposes of this. And I'll expand my full pool to look at the full 1,500. And I'll just look at this from the lens of exposure, right? So like here's already an interesting story, right? There are certain weeks where you have this very flat QB curve of exposure where there's like a lot as an even kind of, I don't know, each QB that follows the one before it is like close to it, right? This is not what we're getting. We're getting like Kyler Murray is by far the most frequently appearing quarterback here in the top. Then it's Lamar Jackson, and then a huge drop down to Daniel Jones, and then like every other quarterback, right? That's already very interesting. At running back, we do have the very flat. So like in this particular case, my perception of this is that these two are by far the best two quarterbacks on the slate. And if I'm seeing that ownership isn't likely to follow that on Sunday, I'm probably going to play some of these guys. Similar on the running back side, right? What I'm seeing here is that there's actually not a lot of difference between the top running backs on the slate. A lot of these guys are very close. If on Sunday, everybody is screaming that the best two overall plays on the slate are Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry, I'm going to say, well, I might maybe fade those guys because I actually think a lot of these guys are pretty equal, right? And you go down the list. That's just kind of like how I think about this. But yeah, I love this process, and I do this every week. So Phil said, I have watched almost all the videos on this channel, and I personally don't touch the sliders. I'm curious for cash games. Would it hurt to put sim variance on one? Sim variance is what makes SaberSim what it is. I have seen videos of Max and Danny talk about this, but I feel like I'm losing my small edge by not taking advantage of the sim variance. It's a really interesting question. It is very interesting. I will say, first of all, let's take this from the standpoint of what would be your advantage to doing so. And I think there is a small advantage. And the advantage is that we always talk about sim variance from the stance of upside, right? By bucketing game sims, you are going to get to take advantage of those extreme outlier conditions in your lineups, which emphasizes upside in your builds, right? When you turn sim variance up a little bit here, what I actually think what the potential advantage that you might get here of doing this in cash game is you are going to lower the potential risk of downside, right? Because even if you're using relatively large buckets of game sims, but not all of them, if players have significant downside outcomes in their range of outcomes, they are going to show up, and their exposure is going to be lowered. It's going to show up less often when you turn sim variance up a little bit. So I think that's the possible advantage. The ultimate question here is, does that outweigh the value of just playing the highest overall average projected lineup? Because if you turn sim variance up past 0, you are not probably going to play the highest overall average projected lineup. And in fact, if you ran this build over and over and over again, you might get a different lineup at the top every time because of the way that those sims are bucketed. I think it is an interesting idea. I think it is an interesting idea. I don't know if I would do it personally for myself. But I really do think it's interesting. And I am like in agreement with you when you said sim variance is what makes SaberSim what it is. It is going to potentially lower the chance of particular players with very heavy downside showing up in your lineups. But it does make me a little bit concerned not taking into account the full range of outcomes for cash lineups. So I don't know. Might need to think about that one a little bit more, Phil, and maybe follow up with you on my kind of final thoughts there. So we just did a cash strategy, and we just did a cash strategy session earlier last week. And part of the main point of that strategy session, first of all, if you haven't seen it, it's on our YouTube channel under strategy sessions, finding an edge in NFL cash games. So me and Max talked a lot about contest selection stuff, but also some strategy. And one of the core points there was that it's not necessarily the end all be all to just force the highest overall projected lineup possible into cash games every week. There is a game theory component of considering ownership. There is you want to consider your risk by when you're rostering players that maybe have injury concerns or things like that, right? So on that particular note, like I feel like maybe there is some merit to this, because we're not necessarily just going to slam the highest projected overall lineup in cash every week anyway. But it is difficult for me to quantify if the advantage you get from doing this in reducing your downside is greater than the disadvantage you get from rostering lineups with overall lower average projected scores. That's really the game here. So I might need to think about that a little bit more. Curious what anybody else thinks too, right? This doesn't have to be a one-way street. Any cash game grinders out there, I'd be interested to hear what you guys think about this, because it's an interesting idea here. So cool. We got 2 Dons in the stream here today. So we'll answer this one here first. Do you think we're diminishing the value of the simulations if we upload our own projections? No, you almost certainly are not, unless you're uploading bad projections. But as long as you're uploading decent projections, what you are just doing, so say you upload projections that shift Tyreek Hill to 22.58 instead of 23.58, we're going to basically take every single game sim that we have for Tyreek Hill, and since you increased his projection or you decreased his projection by 1, we're going to take every single game sim that we have for Hill and subtract 1 from it. And then when we use sim variance and we go through the lineup building process, we're going to use the new updated sims to build the lineups. So it basically just kind of tweaks and moves everybody around a little bit based on where your projections are and where we have them. So no, I don't think you diminish the value of the sims. I mean, obviously it's going to be a matter of how good your projections are. That's really ultimately what it's gonna come down to. But there's value you can add from adjusting projections. We talk about that here quite a bit. There are reasons to do that. So the sims are flexible to that, and they respond in a way that makes sense. And you're still getting everything out of the game simulations that we have when you upload your own projections. So. Okay, Don said, I feel like what you were saying is throw our rules of thumb out of the window. No stacking rules, 2 uniques, team score estimates. Am I not understanding something? Yeah, maybe I've come on a little strong with that idea here. And I don't want to give the impression that there's nothing that you can do to add value in steps 1 and 2, because that's not the case. But I would just be cautious with rules of thumbs that don't allow you to be flexible. Team scores, for example, if you are doing a research process there's a ton of different ways you could do it. Maybe you're looking at Vegas or other books and comparing differences and making adjustments. That's perfectly fine, right? Or that's great because you are allowing yourself to be dynamic. It's a process, it's repeatable, but you're dynamic and you're adaptable to the individual slate that you have. Stacking rules is an interesting one. Like, I think it's fine if you set yourself a wide stacking rule that you say, for example, I always want a QB, I want 1 to 3 pass catchers, and I want 1 run back player, right? That's going to give the builder flexibility to still give you the best overall stacks possible without being overly restrictive. I think that's a fine one. So it's not that no rules of thumb are okay, but you should give yourself rules of thumb that do allow you to be flexible overall. The original question that we were talking about here at the start of the show, I think was kind of implying here. Let me pull up this question a little bit more. So unique player limits, right? If you want to set min uniques at 2, that's fine. That's also really something that I don't think is going to limit the builder or limit your process dramatically. But some of these other things, right? Ownership limits, that one in particular is a little concerning because limiting ownership based on total lineup ownership or individual player ownership is not going to allow you to adapt, and is not going to allow the builder in particularly to be adaptable to the individual slate and give you the best lineups. Variance and correlation parameters too, right? I think that's one that's a little bit necessarily like concerning. Limiting stacks where the QB only has a certain measure of correlation to his wide receiver 1, right, is probably just going to be a human attempt to do something that the computer is going to do better for you out of the gate. So that's kind of what I'm trying to say here, is that be careful with setting any stringent rules that aren't adaptive to the individual slate that you're on, that kind of hamstring the builder from being able to do what it wants to do. And ask yourself, why are you doing what that rule is? And is there a better way that you could accomplish that? So, Don said, related question. I have wondered about this in the context of a run back. Aren't there very few reasons not to have a run back versus having one, especially in higher game totals? Well, the main reason is that correlation is really kind of just one factor here, right? So, for example, let's say you were playing Seattle stacks. So you look at a guy like Russell Wilson, and you're going to see that the opposing players on the other team are positively correlated to Russell Wilson. So say if you were building a lineup and maybe it's just a skinny stack and it's just Russell Wilson plus Metcalf, and there's this open decision of, am I going to roster Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen, right? And you could look at this and say, they're positively correlated with Russell Wilson. Yes, put them in the lineup. But there are other considerations at play here. Would you still want to do that if they were both projected for 10 points each, right? Well, maybe not. Would you still want to do it if they were going to be projected to own 40% each? Maybe not, right? Because there's a range of outcomes that is possible here. And that's kind of what the builder is attempting to basically do with the slider settings. It's saying, okay, we have found that by looking at past contests that have actually ran If you're playing 20 maxes of over 50,000 entrants, it makes sense to weight correlation this much. It makes sense to weight ownership fade this much. And it makes sense to use this kind of level, this amount of game simulations when we're building each lineup. And then the builder is going to kind of parse for you for individual lineups. Does it make sense to have a run back, right? It's going to look at things like the game sims that are into that individual lineup and ask, was this a game where the shootout event took place? Were the player scores high enough to deserve them being in the lineup? Are the players properly correlated to one another? Not every wide receiver is correlated 0.1 to the opposing quarterback. It depends on the game. It depends on the players. It depends on the game script. Sometimes opposing wide receivers are more correlated. Sometimes they are less correlated, right? It's going to look at the ownership of those players. Sometimes you maybe are paying too much ownership to roster the game stack, like Dallas and the Chargers last week, right? Game stacks of that game were probably very popular, and the builder may have found for certain lineups that it was better if you were to play a Cowboys game stack to fade the Chargers on the other side of that, because despite the fact that there were maybe some positive correlations there, if the ownership numbers on the other side of the game were high enough, maybe in that particular lineup, it made more sense to just play the Cowboys side and hope that the Cowboys just won and you use other players from other games. The bigger your overall contest is, this build's taking a long time, so we're not maybe going to be able to see this. I think I set a min uniques 2 rule, which is why it takes a little longer. The bigger your contest is overall, the closer the winning lineups in that contest are going to be to approaching the mathematical optimal lineups you can build. And the further away, the less likely a beautifully correlated lineup is going to show up at the top there, because you're having to get closer to basically just nail the nuts at every position. And similarly, we mimic that aspect of DFS in our builder, because as sim variance goes up, the general impact of correlation slightly comes down, right? Because when sim variance is at 10 and we're using single game simulations to build our lineups, right? Say we're building that Russell Wilson stack and you end up building a lineup based around a game outcome where this game, the Seattle-Minnesota game, goes crazy and it's like 35-38, and the Seattle stack does well and Justin Jefferson scores 28 points or something like that, right? But if DeAndre Hopkins scores 40, DeAndre Hopkins goes into the lineup, right? Because it's so much more points in that particular game sim that it outweighs the value of the correlation component of the builder, and it puts him into the lineup. So in that way, correlation can kind of be diminished a little bit at very high sim variance settings. And it's in line with kind of the way I would think about this. Correlation is going to be a tool that is going to allow you to build lineups that have a greater overall chance of success. But these players with correlations that are even significant correlations, right? Matthew Stafford is not guaranteed to succeed along Cooper Kupp. And by no means is Mike Evans guaranteed to succeed along Stafford. Now, they are positively correlated. Those events are more than likely to happen at the same time, but it's not necessarily going to be optimal to build a game stack into 100% of your lineups. And again, Don is beating me to the punch here. This is an example of letting rules of thumb throw you off when SaberSim doesn't conform strictly to those rules. Exactly, right? You are going to get game stacks, but you're not always going to get game stacks. Now, is there anything wrong with just saying, okay, Jordan, I get it. I hear everything you're saying, but I want to play game stacks? Probably not, but maybe approach that from the lens of, I'm going to let the builder tell me what makes sense to do first, and then I'm going to apply my adjustments after and get my game stacks from lineups where it makes sense to build them, right? I'm going to say, SaberSim, build me your top 500. And then I'm going to say, okay, now give me your favorite game stacks of that group of 500. And another approach would be, again, I don't want to say that the moral of this story is not never use a stacking rule. Another approach would be to say, I ran my test build. I saw what I was getting out of this. I have maybe looked at some of these lineups that aren't game stacked, and given the slate, right, there's all these high total games. I think it's going to be a game stack that wins it, and I want to go with it. So I'm going for a game stack this week, and I'm setting a rule that forces it. So we do something like this, or maybe it's like this, however, whatever you want your individual rule to look like. And now I'm going to run my build, right? But you've at least kind of given some thought. First of all, you're setting a flexible rule here, right? An example of an inflexible rule would be something like this: QB plus 2 wide receivers with a wide receiver run back, right? That's an inflexible rule, right? That doesn't let you get all the great things that SaberSim has to offer, like automatically knowing what good pass catching running backs are to include in stacks, what are good tight ends to include in stacks. There are teams where certain wide receivers are just barely involved at all. Like, do you want to run those guys back? This is an inflexible where I wouldn't use something like this. And I also wouldn't do something like, okay, week 3's here, another week of NFL DFS. I haven't looked at anything all week. I'm sitting down and I'm forcing all of the rules that I set every single week. Because that's what I do. Because when I play DFS, I do all these rules. I 100% do a QB plus 2 wide receivers. I always run back with a receiver. I always correlate my wide receiver and tight end with another running back, wide receiver, and tight end. And I also always correlate my running back with my defense. And I'm doing all this, and I haven't even like given any chance for the builder to kind of do what it does best. And I know what those rules are because frankly, you have to do a lot of those rules on a traditional optimizer because otherwise the lineups just kind of suck. They don't work right. They're not correlated correctly. But we get correlation. We leverage correlation correctly for the contest you're playing right out of the gate, and you can spend your time dialing that in and tidying everything up at the end instead of spending a bunch of time setting the rules in the first place. So. Don said, and this is why you don't want to rely on putting a bunch of rules in an optimizer. At some point, your brain can't process all the effects each rule is having on the others. Yeah, it's just, I mean, it's part of the reason why optimizers kind of like existed to begin with. There's almost already too much information for you to really pass through yourself here, right? Like a human can't even, like, you couldn't even just give projected points and salaries to a human and expect them to come up with an optimal with no help from a computer very quickly, right? Throw in ownership and correlation and upside and payout structures and all these other concepts that you kind of need to, and contest sizes and entry limits and all these other concepts that impact the way you would build lineups, right? It's too much. There's no way. So pass that kind of stuff off to the tool, let the tool handle that, and then let what you can bring that's valuable to the table shine through, right? There are things that people can do that add a lot of value to the tool that a computer's not going to do well. We talked about one earlier. A computer's not going to pick up on narratives or what humans are likely to do from an ownership standpoint very easily. Actually, in fact, modeling ownership is very hard. Have you ever looked at a slate and just like after just a couple seconds, you're like, yeah, no, I know who's going to be chalky, right? That happens to me pretty often. I've been playing DFS for a long time, but that happens to me all the time, right? That happens quickly. And that's a good spot to add value. Adjust ownership projections, right? There's a value of like gut and intuition, right? You don't have to be necessarily hyper data driven. You can allow SaberSim to parcel the data for you, give you the best 500 lineups and say, I've been watching a lot of football this year, and I think people are undervaluing how good the Lions offense actually looks, right? Maybe that's not true. I don't know. They've looked okay. And I'm going to play a little more Lions, right? And then the builder is going to say, okay, here's the best lineups that have some Lions in it and help you out there. There's all kinds of things that you can do to add value as a human where you're not wasting time doing the things that the computer does better for you anyway. So anyway, we are just over an hour here. Let's see. Let me make sure I don't have any. Oh, there was one other question. This was from Donnie in Slack. We have 2 Dons and a Donnie here. That's awesome. Unless this is the same guy. But yeah, real quick. Other Don here said game theory is our best added value. Yeah, I agree with that as well. That's another thing where like the builder is going to understand ownership. But if you want to add some like kind of game theory components to that, like or especially if you're going to leverage against certain game outcomes, that's another spot that you can add value, right? Figuring out how to maximize your edge when you fade a certain player is interesting. That's something that maybe the computer's not going to do as well. So anyway, okay. So this last question here, when game projections are changed, will they reset on the next build? Also, any specific contest recommendations on Yahoo? I have not played there before. Thanks. Okay, yeah. So first of all, if you edit player projections and you move this stuff around, we are never going to overwrite this. And that is very important to talk about or very important to know. We will never, ever overwrite it because the main concern is we don't want people, especially right up until lock, spending all their time getting in their projections dialed in, whether they've uploaded them or adjusted team totals, and then we run some minor sim that doesn't really change much, and it overwrites everybody's projections, right? So that's why we don't do it. But it is important to note that if you do want the latest updated projections, you are going to need to reset and update your projections, right? To get the latest build in there. So I would say in general, the last sims that we run for football games typically come out when the inactives come out for that game. But sometimes there are some minor sims that come out after that. But for the most part, the final sims come out around inactives. For baseball, it's when the lineup cards come out. So I would try to avoid doing too many kind of crazy adjustments here before then, because you will have to remove them to reset your projections to the new defaults. I mean, the one thing to note about that is if you do adjust these, for example, so say you've made adjustments to like these players and then you click rebuild, we will update what we have in our SaberSim proj column. So if Kyler Murray, if you, for example, you know that you adjusted this to 28 and on the new updated sim, he jumps to 32 or something like that for whatever reason, that you could use that as a tool to say, okay, now I'm a little too low on him and I'm going to bump that up to match that. But we will never directly overwrite your custom projections under any circumstances. So let me know if that helps, Donnie, our third Don or Donnie of the day here today. Jeff said, any chance you could spend some time on MMA in the near future? I'd be happy to talk MMA. It definitely kind of helps me overall. If you've got like a specific question or something that you would like me to kind of talk about overall, MMA for me personally is one of the sports that I am very active in the DFS portion of the sport. But I don't watch very much MMA, and I don't think you need to. I don't think you need to for any sport. But this is like one of those sports in particular that I have like a very data-driven approach to my play. I don't know who these guys are. I have maybe watched like just a couple MMA fights in my life. I'm still successful at MMA, but that's kind of just like I play in a very, very data-driven approach. My approach overall is very similar to other sports. The one thing to note here is at the moment, we just have raw projections. For these guys, we don't have sims. We're super close on the sims. So maybe I'll follow up with the team here too, especially now that NFL season is kicked off, because I know the sims are really, really close. And once we get the sims up, you can actually click on these guys and you'll be able to get their ranges of outcomes, and we can update the sliders to use sim variance. And then we can do back testing on the sliders, which is great. So I'd love to have that done, but my process for now is very similar to what I do in other sports. I like running my research builds and seeing how often certain players show up as optimal. I lost my train of thought. For sliders, I like to use, I typically use the PGA sliders as a guideline because I think I've mentioned this here before on stream, right? They're both sports where you're setting 6 individual players. The players don't really have strong correlations to one another, except for obviously the fighters fighting each other, but you're never going to roster those anyway. And they're high variance sports. So I've found like for an average 20 max 50K person contest or something like that, like a lot of times I play sliders that are like similar to like this. Yeah. Now that I'm thinking about it, there's definitely things to talk about here. So, I mean, Jeff, if you have any specific questions, our next office hours stream will actually be Monday of next week, because tomorrow we are doing the NFL model strategy session. And on Friday, we are doing a strategy session for researching stacks in NFL and finding the right NFL stacks. So Monday will be our next strategy session for like basic open Q&A. So if you have any questions, specific questions about MMA process using SaberSim to build MMA lineups, I would say ask me on Monday. And if you want another option, is I would be happy to just go in and kind of maybe give a brief walkthrough of like what I do. But again, I don't know how helpful that is to people. And if there's specific questions, I'm happy to answer those instead. So, and I will find out about the status of these sims, because I know they're super close. I know that with football kicking off, we were a little delayed getting them out, but these are just raw projections right now. So we just project like a mean raw here projection, but we have MMA sims that are super close, that we could just get up here and then use those as the projections. So Jeff said, after I lose money this weekend, I'm sure I will. Yeah. I've had a little bit of a skid on MMA. I had a good, man, it was probably back in like May now. I had a really good, I tied for first on, man, I can't even remember which one it was. It was sometime early in the summer, late spring. And I like made all of my money for MMA for the year, because I split first. I was duplicated, but I had a really good showing there. And it was some like relatively small card. It wasn't even like an exciting fight. It wasn't like one of the big pay-per-view fights. It was a small card, and split it with 7 or 8 of my closest friends. So anyway, guys, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up there. Enjoy the I said MMA. Enjoy the baseball slate tonight if you are playing any baseball here. They've been kind of nice ways to get through the week while we're all waiting for football. So I've been enjoying those. We've got NFL Showdown tomorrow night, which should be a lot of fun. I mentioned we'll be doing the NFL model strategy session tomorrow with Matt and Will, and I think Andy's joining me for that one as well too. So we'll be talking about how we simulate the NFL game. And then on Friday, we'll have Max on stream here talking about finding the right stacks in NFL DFS. So the whole idea of, how does SaberSim help to lead you to well-constructed, high upside stacks? But also, how can you add value to that process? So if you've ever had a question of, okay, I get how SaberSim works, I know what's going on here, but how can I help add value to deciding what stacks I'm going to play in football? I'd check that strategy session out. Or if you have any questions that are more on the side of how is SaberSim deciding what stacks I should play, right? Why do I get Buccaneers stacks or Viking stacks or Seattle stacks, right? That's another good strategy session to come and listen to. So if you have any questions about any of those concepts, pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack, and we will get to them on those shows. Enjoy any DFS you're playing. In the meantime, I will talk to you guys all here tomorrow. Until then, take care. See ya.